Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this beautiful Wednesday morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Barrett Wamers, and I'm really excited about today's webinar. Jonathan Sue will be presenting to us on how to add custom fields to users. So as always, we like to just jump in and talk through the control panel to make sure you understand how to use it to get the most out of today's session. So to start, at the very top of the window, you'll notice a little minimize or hide collapse arrow. So if that little control panel is in your way, just go ahead and collapse that. And then if you have questions, you can expand it later on. By default, everyone's microphone is muted. If you do want to have audio rights, just let us know and we will gladly give that to you. I'll double check to make sure you actually meant to request the audio, but we'd love to hear from you. We also suggest that you make the webinar full screen. This makes it a better user experience for you. You're able to see the details a little bit more and just get a little bit more out of the whole session. And lastly, if you do want to raise your hand for audio rights, go ahead and do that at any point. And if you have questions or comments, there is a question area of the control panel. Additionally, I'll put some links in the chat section, so you'll have those available as well. Today's session is recorded, and in the next 48 hours, we will send you the recording along with all the materials that we cover and some additional links. Before I hand it over to John, let's go ahead and do a quick poll here. So if you could just take a second and let us know. And with that, John, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Sounds great. Thanks, Barrett. And like Barrett said earlier, welcome everybody. Happy to be presenting this topic today on how to add custom user or custom fields to users. This is a topic that came up in conversation with some customers. I myself have built some of these solutions for customers in the past, and we felt like it was a really good topic to present on because not only is it really easy to implement, it opens up a whole host of different opportunities to really extend the iFormBuilder platform and to do a lot more with it. It's really a level up moment for a lot of our customers in terms of just their understanding of the platform, but also in terms of what they're capable with doing in terms of building out kind of a larger platform for data collection and what I like to call operationalizing your data, doing things with the data afterwards. So what we're going to be covering today is we're going to do a brief introduction on iFormBuilder users. I always want to start with that as a foundation so you understand what an iFormBuilder user is, the properties and characteristics that are associated with a user, and then as a result, we'll also talk about some of those limitations, which is what we will be addressing with the use case of today's webinar. After we cover what users are, we're going to then look at the lookup element, which is one of our newer elements. We released it I want to say like 2020. It's been about 3 years or so. It's the spiritual successor to Smart Table Search. I actually, the last webinar that I presented the other month was on converting Smart Table Search to lookup elements. So we're almost going to pick up where we left off and talk about a novel use case for implementing the lookup element that will involve extending user fields. And then after we've set up the entire process, the entire form, we'll then talk about some common use cases, how you can use this technique in your own forms, in your own environment, and just give you kind of those next steps and hopefully start some of the ideation process so you can think through how we can implement this further. Before we dive into the actual specifics of the webinar, I do have a poll set up that I would like to be able to ask people. And this is just going to help me get a baseline on where everyone is in terms of their comfort with users and the applicability of what we're covering today as well.
All right, John, I did just launch the poll. I hope it was
Perfect.
The correct
Yep.
one for you.
It is.
Okay, great. So if everyone could just take another second here and fill this in. Looks like almost everyone has voted, and I'm going to close the poll and share the results so
Perfect.
you can have a greater understanding.
All right. these are actually like perfect results. I'm happy to see that a lot of people, the majority of attendees, do have additional fields they'd like to associate with your users, and then the rest of the attendees are unsure. And so by the end of this webinar, I think that you should have more clarity into that. And at a minimum, if you're still not sure if it's something that you'd want to do, you'll have the tools and able to implement if and when it does become something that you want to include in the way you develop your iFormBuilder account. So let's go ahead and dive on in. We're going to talk about iForm users first, as I mentioned. Now, when you create a user in iForm, it has 4 primary properties. So you have your first name, your last name, your email, and then your username. The username is what must be unique. It's how you log into the platform. First name, last name, and email, you can almost think of it as like metadata for that user, right? It's those fields are often used in built-in functions. They're also used so you can identify kind of whose user is which. But that's the extent of what an iForm user has at its disposal. And from feedback that we've received from customers and also in building out these projects, we recognize that customers want other fields associated with their users. Now, it's not that we've ignored those requests. It's simply that because iForm is a generic platform, it's challenging for us to know which fields to include because it won't be applicable for all customers, depending on your industry or your use case or your organizational structure. The fields will have varying levels of usefulness to you. So that's why we're going to look at this methodology of implementing custom fields. This is going to allow you to define whatever fields you want, use them in an almost exactly analogous way as if they were embedded directly into the user object itself. So you're really going to get the best of both worlds. Now, what we're going to be setting up is taking the iForm user, which again has these 4 fields, first name, last name, email, and username, and we're going to be extending that with a custom table. And in this webinar, what we're going to be building onto this custom table are 4 other fields: an employee ID, phone number, a role, and then the team that you belong to. Now, in terms of high-level design requirements, it's really important to note that we want to make sure this feels good for the end user, this feels good for the designer as well. So the user, so the person on the app itself, should not have to select themselves. I shouldn't have to say, oh, this is who I am when I'm filling out a form. And equally important, I also shouldn't be able to say, hey, I'm somebody else. I shouldn't be able to choose Barrett, for example, when we're making this connection between who I am as a logged in user and then who is selected from the additional custom fields. We want all of that to operate behind the scenes to, 1, make data collection more seamless, and 2, to maintain the integrity of the data as well. And the way we're going to implement this, the way we're going to achieve this, is by using a hidden lookup table with auto select. And so what that's going to allow us to do is, based on whoever's logged into the device, we'll have a lookup table with all of those users. It will auto select whoever is logged in for the integrity component. And we're going to make sure that element is hidden so that the field user, the person who's on the app, doesn't see it. It all happens behind the scenes in the background, making sure that they still have a very efficient, seamless data collection experience. I have a few slides here set up. I'm mostly going to be diving into the actual platform and demonstrating the building of the techniques, but I did want to go through some of these screen captures that I have as we lead into the things we're going to be doing. So first on the left here, I have a screenshot from the user management of this user that I've created. I'm actually logged in as this user right now. But this iForm user ID is what I'm going to be interested in particular. So this is a system generated ID for that user. It will be unique. Important to note, if I were to delete this user and recreate another user with the same username, they would have a new user ID. Right? And so this is one of the reasons I like to use this field, as opposed to the username or the email, which could be reused or recycled or even duplicated. In the middle here, I have a quick screenshot from the form builder. This is going to be our database table. So this is the table that we're going to be referencing from. We're using it as a lookup. And you'll notice that I have user ID, employee ID, phone, role, and team. Now these bottom 4 fields were what I mentioned in the slide prior. I added in user ID at the top here because that's what we're going to be using to make our connection between logged in user and the row that we want to pull from this table. And then finally, I have a quick screenshot over here of the form that we're going to be building. The form is in its initial stage with user ID, username, first name, last name, email. All of those iForm associated fields to the user pre-populated, which is where I'm actually going to switch off of the slides and hop over to the form builder now. So we'll pick up from there. I'm going to do a quick refresh just to make sure that we're not logged out. Beautiful. All right, so those 4 fields that we had, we have them all pre-populating. And so actually, let me switch to my table view. We can show these all in one screen. I'm going to show the dynamic value and the condition value. We're going to spend a lot of time in this view during the webinar, but what's important to note about these fields is that all of them are being dynamically populated with our built-in functions. So we're using the user ID, username, first name, last name, and email to auto-load these fields. Right now, they are shown on the device. We could hide them by adding a false here, but I wanted to keep them visible for now so that you can see the fields as we build out the form. The very last step is going to be where we control some of the visibility at the very end of the webinar. Now, I also have over here my user DB table. So this has, again, my user ID, employee ID, phone, role, and team. For the sake of simplicity on the webinar, I've made all of these read-only fields, except for the phone number, which I set as a phone element. If you want to be more strict about your data governance, for example, if you only have a few defined teams for your organization, I would actually recommend making this a pick list and then associating an option list with it. Similar for role. That's going to give you an added level of confidence and integrity with your data. You make sure that if someone's doing like a CSV upload of the users, for example, they're not going to enter a team that is invalid or a role that is invalid. But again, as I mentioned, for the sake of this webinar, we'll keep everything pretty simple, just use read-onlys. Now, this other tab I'm going to go to very briefly is the user DB data view. I just want to show you that I've seeded this initially with a field, or with a row rather, and I know this text can be a little small. So in this row, I have user ID, which matches my own personal user ID. What we're going to be doing in the webinar is when I open up this form, it should pre-populate these fields. I have a randomly generated employee ID, a pretend phone number, and then a team and a role assigned to myself. So my team is customer success, and my role, I just specified manager, something kind of generic. So from here, the next thing we need to do is figure out how we're going to bring the 2 tables together. How are we going to use this data table in our data collection form? And the way we're going to do this to begin with is by adding a lookup element. And so at the bottom of this form, I'm going to add my lookup element. Now, when I create this element, I'm going to call this user lookup. Not a requirement, but one thing I do want to note is I found this to be a common practice of mine for lookup elements, smart table searches. I tend to use this underscore lookup suffix just for easy recognition of what the different elements are. As we continue to populate the properties for this element, I'm going to choose the table that I'm using for lookup, which is my user DB. And then finally, I'm going to choose the fields that I want to display. Now, in all fairness, the fields are actually not that important for display here because we're not actually going to be showing the element. It's going to be auto-selected in the background. But for now, I'm just going to go ahead and choose a few of these. I'll choose these 3 columns. I'll assign this. And at this point, you'll notice that the little warning icon has disappeared. I'm going to save this very briefly. And then we're going to load this up on web form so you can see what the state is like right now.
Hey, John, while that's loading, we have 2 questions. One is, there's someone who's still using the old iFormBuilder interface. For that type of setup, how would they go about getting the user ID?
That's a good question. If you're in the old interface, what I recommend doing is because it doesn't show the user ID in the table. If you choose the user and go to edit, you can actually grab the user ID from the URL. You'll see it says user ID equals, and the value is up there. That's kind of the easy way through the interface. Honestly, the way I normally grab the user IDs is I use the API to do like an export of all the users. If that person or anyone else is interested in that, I think we can take the conversation offline. I'm happy to walk through what that solution looks like later on.
Awesome, thank you. And then the other question is, it's more of a statement.
Sure.
Asking about using more iFormBuilder built-in functions, so also adding like the device ID, OS version, and just, our 20 some odd iFormBuilder built-in functions. Would it make sense to use those, or do you think that's too much data that you'd be putting in here?
It's a good question. I think that the best place to start with is understanding your goals with the form. So for example, in this webinar, we're trying to keep a very simple use case. And so I only included the fields that pertain to the user. Like you mentioned, there's so many built-in functions that we can use. The ones for app version, OS version, device model, device language, I've found those to be absolutely invaluable when it comes to troubleshooting. And so as the administrator of an account, if I have to troubleshoot when a user says, hey, my form didn't work the way I thought it was going to work, and I want to know, are they on iOS or Android? What version of iForm do they have? What version of the form did they fill out even? Those fields are really helpful. And so if that's one of your goals in your form building design, then I absolutely say to include them. I also do want to caution some of our customers I know have built really, really, really big forms to the point where actually they may not even have the ability to add those columns to that one form, right? So you may not want to add every single built-in function that we have there. In those cases, maybe you want to be a little bit more selective with what you choose to add to your form. But in an ideal state, you start with a blank canvas, you start with these built-in functions because I do think they provide tremendous value, and you go from there. So short answer, yes, I would recommend adding as many of them as you find useful.
Great, thank you.
Awesome. All right, so I loaded up my my form here. I'm using web forms to demo just because it's convenient to do this within my browser. And I wanted to show you the lookup element itself here. So when I do the lookup element, and if you weren't here for the webinar last week, or not last week, last webinar, where we talked about smart table search versus lookup element. In a smart table search, you only get one column that you display, whereas in a lookup element, you can choose multiple. If we recall from the setup, I chose user ID, employee role, and employee team. And so you'll see those fields shown here. If I make the selection, that element is populated. Right now, going back to those design decisions that we had set up at the beginning of this, we don't want the user to have to select a person. And we also don't want them to be able to select somebody who they are not. And so the next step here is going to be to enhance this lookup element to achieve both of those things. We will restrict it to only selecting or only being able to choose myself. And then we're also going to make it choose me automatically. So let's go back over here to the form builder. We're going to add 2 dynamic attributes to this element. If you're not familiar with dynamic attributes, they are essentially the same things as you have up here, but they're element specific. And this allows us to have a more robust interface around them as well. So the first one I want to add is a filter. What the filter is going to do is it's going to restrict the rows that are shown based on whatever condition I establish. Okay. And so let me actually refresh this page. And so as I choose this filter, I'm going to set the user ID I want to be equal to. And now down here in the field value, I'm going to use my user ID element. All right, this is why we're including it in the form. I'm going to use my full form path to make sure I avoid any caching issues. And I will confirm this. Okay. So now that we have this set up, let's do a quick save. And before we test, I'm also going to add one other row here because otherwise you won't be able to tell if it's filtered, if that's the only value in here. We're going to add some fictitious data in here. Let's see. Okay. Same thing here. Oops. And then let's just say, let's set this up to be a little different. And so now that we have 2 users in here, we set it up where it's going to match based on the user ID. That is what we're looking for. And so when I refresh this page and I reload it, as it downloads the new version of the form as well, when we open up the lookup element, we should still only see that one row. We should not see that new row as an option to be selected, right? Which is what we have here. So that second row is not selectable. I've achieved my first requirement, which is that I can only be me. There's no way to like spoof who I am. And so now we want to completely avoid the act of having to select and choose. To do that, we're going to add a second dynamic attribute to my lookup element, and this is the auto select. Now, as I read this text here for what auto select does, this will auto populate the lookup element under a very specific condition, which is that only one lookup record is available for choosing to be selected. If I didn't have this filter, there would be 2 rows that could be potentially chosen. And so the lookup element would not auto-populate. It would require the user to make a selection. However, because we're using these 2 attributes in tandem with one another, we're going to get the achieved or the desired effect. The filter is going to restrict this to a single row, and then auto select is going to make sure that we choose that row without having to interact with the element itself. So let me go ahead and save. And then once this is done saving, I will refresh this one more time. And then when the form loads, it should be selected not by default, but automatically. So we'll take a look at this. All right, so as this loads, you'll see it pops up right away. So now what we have is whoever is logged in, that user ID is going to pull from the user table. And now the beauty of this is I have all of this data at my disposal for parsing within my form. And so that's what we're going to do next. We're going to go ahead and add a few elements. Let's go ahead and add elements for employee ID, phone, role, and team. We'll just add all 4 of them. And so to do this, I'm going to just use 4 read-only elements. I'm going to do a quick save. I'm going to hop over into my table view because it's a little bit faster. And we will add these in. So the first field was the employee ID. And then we had the employee phone. And we had employee role. And these don't have to be in the same order as the lookup table. I'm just doing this out of convenience, but they could be in any order, and they don't have to be next to each other either. They can be anywhere in the form as well. But we have these 4 here now. And the next step is to parse from that lookup element into these fields. So we'll add our dynamic value. And the way we're going to reference the lookup element is like any other element, actually. We'll start with the form name. We'll use the element name next, which is user lookup. And then from within that row, we'll grab the field that we want. And we named them all the same. So this is a very straightforward implementation. Employee ID, I'm going to do a quick copy. And I'll just update each one of these. Instead of ID, this is phone. This is role. And this is team. So now we have all of these dynamically populated. When I hop over here to do a quick refresh, we should see the desired effect, which is when I load in, whoever I'm logged in as, I'm going to get that full list of user fields, partly pulled from the iForm user identity and partly pulled from our custom table. And so once this information is in the form and we see it's loading automatically, what we can start doing is we can start building things off of this depending on those values. So for example, let's build a real simple field with a condition value. And so we're going to just leave the name this as is, and under condition value, we're going to say custom user permissions dot employee team equals customer success. And so this field should only show if the logged in user has an employee team equal to customer success. So I'll save this real quick, and then we'll reload the page, and that element should be visible when we fully load everything inside of the form. So we have all of this, we get our pre-populating information, and then our element is shown down here for us to interact with. And so this is really kind of the foundational piece. This is the point where I think everybody in attendance, any customer can benefit from these steps up till here. The fields that you include in your custom table and how you use them in the form is where we're going to start getting branching use cases. Different customers are going to have different ways to extend this technique and use it for their own, turn it into their own. I want to pause here for a second. Barrett, are there any questions that came up over the last few minutes that I can answer?
Not yet, but I'm sure as time goes on and it sinks in, there might be some more.
Cool, sounds good. So as a recap, right, we have the iForm user, that first screenshot on the left has a user ID, username, first name, last name, email. We go ahead and build a user DB for our custom fields. Those included employee ID, phone, role, and team. Then we went ahead and built out a form where we used the iFormBuilder built-in functions to populate the user-specific fields, or user-related fields is maybe the better way to put it. And then we added a lookup element to our form where we set this up to filter, so I can only be me, as well as auto-select, so I don't have to interact with the element. And the final step we did here is we added our new fields for the parsing off of the lookup element. And so I have the lookup field highlighted here, the fields parsed from it down here. And if you notice on the screenshot, we have these fields set to false. It's actually the last thing I want to do is hop back over to my table view, go to my condition value, and we're going to set the lookup to false. And we're going to leave it just like this for now. I'm going to save this and then reload this. Only that lookup should be hidden. We're going to show the other fields. Now, depending on your circumstance, you may want to hide all of these fields, or you may want to show them to give the end user an opportunity to say, hey, my stuff's not right. Like the information in the user table is outdated. Maybe I have a new phone number. And by showing this, you give that field user the opportunity to identify mistakes. However, because we have it set up as a read-only, it's not like they can come in here and edit the information. So you'll see the lookup element is hidden. There's no need to interact with it. From the end user's point of view, it looks like they have a whole bunch of different properties associated with their user, all loading at the same time. They have no idea it's from two different sources. And again, the beauty of this is we can define whatever we want for these lower fields, depending on your own specific context. And then we can use that, for example, in condition values to show hide elements. So at this point, I did have one other poll that I prepared that we can ask the audience, Barrett, if you can tee that up.
Yep, it's loaded.
Awesome. And I'm just curious, and I know some of the people in the webinar were not sure if they had a use for these custom fields, but for those of you who are, and maybe you have a better idea now and you've actually changed your vote to a yes, I'm just curious if that lookup data is stored somewhere in an external system, something like an ERP like SAP, or maybe a CRM. Maybe you have stuff stored in like Salesforce, or even some sort of internal platform that you use. It's been my experience that a lot of customers, this information is already existing somewhere else. And so I just wanted to ask this question. I'm honestly just curious to see where the distribution is with our attendees.
So it looks about 50% of the attendees have responded. So if you're on the other half who haven't responded yet, just take a quick second and fill out the poll, and then we'll go ahead and close that and we'll share the results. All right, so it looks like everyone has voted now, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share those results.
Awesome. Oh, very interesting. So we've got half are unsure, and then we have some yes, some no. Very interesting, not unexpected, but it is interesting. For the people who are in the yes camp, I did want to kind of highlight this paradigm where that information already exists somewhere else, because for the customers that I've implemented this with in the past, this has been like stage one. We create this user table, we do a CSV upload to set it up so that you can have these dynamic forms or dynamic workflows off this information. But then inevitably, we want to mature that. And so the next stage, that level 2, has been building integrations where that information is piped into iFormBuilder through DFA, data flow automation. So the user or the customer will send the data from their Salesforce environment to DFA for the purpose of updating iForm automatically. So now, as the iForm admin, I don't have to manage that table anymore, and I can be confident in the data that's in there. So if you're in that boat, I just wanted to throw that out there for you all. If you're not, then you're kind of going to be managing this manually anyways. And for those of you who are unsure, if this is something you want to implement, it might not be a bad question to kind of tease out first to see if that data exists somewhere else. And maybe what you can do is take step 1 and 2 and actually just do them all together in one shot. And then at the end of it, you have a really mature implementation for custom fields for your users in iForm. Okay. Awesome. Thank you, Barrett. All right. So the last thing I wanted to go through with everybody was some common use cases for this technique. As I mentioned, using the built-in functions, using the lookup table, parsing off the lookup table. That is where we would all be on a common journey. And it's from that point that the use cases diverge. And so for those of you who are maybe trying to think if this is applicable for you, I wanted to provide some common use cases to maybe stimulate some ideas for you. And then for those of us who have already a common known need on how to implement this, I also wanted to let you all know that there are other ways that you can use this to even further implement and make use of that user DB table. So first common use case are things like manager-only fields. What I demonstrated in the form, adding that select with a condition value, is essentially this bullet. I write manager only because the most common use case I see for this is you have a person fill out a form and you have that form get assigned to their manager. And within that form, there's actually additional fields that only the manager is supposed to be able to view. For groups who have implemented this in a very basic way, they'll like hard code the username and the condition value if the user is, so-and-so. But that's not a very maintainable solution. Implementing this will allow you to have your users set up in a separate data table. You can choose who the managers are, and those fields will only show for those users. So if the user has that role, then those fields will be shown. It doesn't have to be a manager, right? It could be, you can set it up for any type of person or user or functional role who will be interacting with the form. Even I've worked with, for example, agriculture groups in the past where certain fields only pertain to certain crops. And so you can do things like that as well. Certain people are responsible for certain things. You define that in your user table and you use it in the forms. Another novel approach I wanted to add in here is adding signatures to UserDB. What we had in that table right now was kind of all text-based, right? It was, employee ID, role, team, phone number. But you can also actually add media to this as well. There's nothing stopping you from using a signature element or an image element for that user DB table. This specific example I can tell you is for a customer who wants to create these letters. So they actually use the software as an intake mechanism when they go through and they want to create like a quote or some sort of an offering, a good faith estimate. They want that letter to have a nice polished look to it. And so what we did was we had all the users use iForm to capture a signature. We stored that signature in the user DB table. And then when they generate their letters, that signature is pulled in as an image file. So then you get this really nice professional looking letter as if it was signed from that user. So similar use case to the manager only, just wanted to highlight that it doesn't have to be text-based elements only. Another common use case for this is as a validation check for employee not found. So that can mean a few different things. But if you don't have a match in the lookup table, for whatever reason, you may not want that person to be able to continue with data collection. And so you can then hide the elements. You can set up a client validation if you want. But employee not found can mean more than just they don't exist. Another common use case is to add a select element to the lookup table for active, yes or no. So what we've done in the past is we've had times where we have seasonal field collectors, and when it's the off season, we don't want them to be able to collect data, but we also didn't want to delete their user outright from the platform. So what do? We set them to inactive in the user DB table. So if they were to open up iForm and try to fill out a record, it won't let them. We validate against that field. So it's really helpful for context changes that are temporal or temporary in that scenario. Another common use case here is to define a direct supervisor. This is very similar to the manager only fields, but another, again, common use case that I've seen. If you know and have a defined sequence, user A is supposed to submit their form to user B, and then it goes to user C, and you have this like approval process. You can define that in the user DB table to either pre-populate, assign 2 elements, I've seen that in the past, or to actually use that table with the API to pull from to then make dynamic workflows off of thereafter. So when you for example, in this case, define a direct supervisor, it doesn't have to be restricted to the form. Understand that once that data is defined in iFormBuilder, using the iForm API, you have full access to it. And you can build really dynamic, robust workflows by pulling that information and then routing off of it. And then the final use case I wanted to highlight was once you take that lookup value, you parse out from it. It's very common. We see people take those values and then they use that as a filter for a subsequent lookup element. So let's say, for example, we have our existing user information, employee information, and depending on the team you're on or the role you're in, let's say you have like an inventory database afterwards that you want to select from, but certain team members only have access to certain assets in that inventory DB. You set up your inventory DB to include a column for the team if they're allowed to view it, and then you use the parse value to filter the lookup, the inventory lookup element. And so, like I said, we work up to the foundation, but it really branches out into really a multitude of different novel use cases you can implement from this point forward. Barrett, that pretty much wraps up everything that I wanted to present to our audience today. Are there any questions before I hand things off to you to close out?
Yeah, there's just one more question. Actually, a few more are coming in as I say that. Okay. But the first one is just how difficult and how do you go about adding in media into these lookups? So the example you gave for the signature or even having a photo ID a part of it. How difficult is that? What's the process look like? If you could just talk a little bit more, that'd be great.
Absolutely. It's actually a lot easier than you would think. The user DB table, we've implemented this as a lookup. We populated it from the control panel. So we did like a little upload here. When I create a new record, if you have an image element in here, There's nothing stopping you from, I mean, I'll even do it right now. We can just go ahead and quickly add an image element here. Oops. And it's as simple as adding that as part of the data when you upload. So what you'll see is after I save this, if I were to create a new record here, you can just choose a file, right? So ID, signature, whatever it be. For the customer I was referencing in my story earlier, actually the other thing we did for them is part of the onboarding process onto iForm for that user is we asked them to create this record. It was a really nice way to get the user onto the platform and interacting with the app for a first time. So they learned how to navigate, they learned how to fill in the different fields and elements. And so we actually asked users to fill this in the first time. That functioned as a seed for the lookup table, and we were able to use it thereafter. So, you know, add the media element. If we do it through the control panel, it's an easy process. And then also there's no reason we can't democratize the process and ask the users to fill out the field for themselves as well.
Great. And I think that use case of having the person fill it out themselves is awesome. The next question is about the ability to actually edit the user management screen to see if there's a way to add your own custom fields to that user management screen versus going through the app and doing it this way.
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. The short answer is you can edit the fields that are existing, but you can't add another property that you would like to apply to all users within that interface. Covered it at the beginning. It's not that we haven't heard customers. It's not that we're ignoring that aspect or that request or requirement. It's simply that our customer base is so diverse. It's really impossible for us to choose fields that are going to be universally applicable to all of our customers. And so what you end up happening is a subset of them get kind of exactly what they want, but the larger group at whole ends up having these fields that they just don't use. And so defining it as custom, we felt like this was the best way to implement that customization to the level that we're happy with.
Great, thank you. Those are that's the end of the questions.
Awesome, cool. All right, Bert. Well, I'll briefly say thank you for everybody for attending, joining, and if anyone has any questions, I know that there were a couple of questions about populating the data and a couple of things in terms of taking that information offline, getting the user ID. Happy to help. Just reach out to us, and like I said, we'll cover that on a one-on-one basis offline. But I appreciate everybody joining today, and it's been a pleasure. So Barrett, I'll hand it back off to you.
All right, well, thank you, John. And if everyone could just bear with me for another minute here, we do have a few announcements. The first is that we now have Zerion Academy asynchronous getting started courses that are available. You may have received an email about a month ago saying that you had access to it and then ended up losing access. I have all the steps mapped out, and we'll share it with the follow-up email with how you can now go through and get those getting started courses. Also, in September, we have our Zerion Reimagined on-site workshops. This is like a tech conference. We're really excited about it. It's in about 2 weeks. If you think you're going to attend, please sign up soon. We are trying to reach out to everyone who's attending, see if there's any dietary restrictions. Also, we're looking for some presenters. So if you want to present, let us know, and we'd be happy to have you present your solution at our on-site Zerion Reimagined. And lastly, we have 2 upcoming webinars on September 20th. We have Form Building 102, the building blocks of smart controls. This builds off of the webinar we had earlier this month about the basics of form building. And then on October 4th, we have our public link forms, that they're more than just forms, so other ways to utilize public links and make it more a part of your end user experience. And with that, I just want to say thank you to everybody for attending. Thank you, John, for presenting. We will follow up with all the links, including the Zerion Reimagined links, so that you can go ahead and sign up. And if you have questions, of course, reach out. Have a great rest of your day.